Hello and welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Richards. This week I'm talking to Roy Horrobin, who's standing for Parliament in Cleethorpes and Immingham in the Liberal Democrat interest. Roy, thank you very much for coming in. First of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? Are you a local lad?
I'm a school teacher. I've lived here for over 20 years now. Currently I'm working out of town at another school. I'd like to be back. I've got interest in politics, I guess, because of various local campaign groups. That's sort of drawn me in. Is that enough?
Yep. Well, no, maybe a little bit more. I mean, first of all, I just do want to mention that you're a historian.
Yeah.
You're a history teacher, and that's a historian. You're standing for Parliament. It's in its 750th year now. Do you have ambitions to make history?
Yeah, and I think that's the whole point about politics. And I know we had a brief conversation about Russell Brand beforehand, and where I think he gets it wrong is that if you get involved in politics as a councillor, as an MP, even if you get involved in campaigning in any way at all, I think you can significantly shape your community, shape the national community, shape things further beyond, yes. So, yeah, of course. What's the point otherwise?
And you mentioned Russell Brand there. I mean, you're preaching to the choir on a political programme like this, of course. We're all interested in politics, but you would think his idea that don't bother to vote, all politics is corrupt and not worth it, that's cynical and nihilistic.
I think it is cynical, and I go along with that as well, that it's nihilistic. I would agree with that. But also I think there's something worse. I think there's something ridiculously naive about it. Within human beings there is a tendency at times to not be honest. There is a tendency when under pressure to not tell the truth. There is a tendency to be selfish. But then there's the other things as well. And I think that he seems to be suggesting we just step away from all those centuries of tradition, but doesn't give a solution to how you build it up. And I don't think things work like that. I think change is gradual, and then sometimes there's an opportunity, and that's what I'd argue as a Liberal I would be good at, where you can push something. So locally, for me, it's renewables. Well,
I just want to stay in the slightly more universal for a moment. You say there that change is evolutionary rather than revolutionary.
I would go along with that, yes.
That sounds very conservative.
No, not at all. I'd say it's very English, and being Liberal is a very English tradition. And you just look at I was thinking of something that Martin Vickers said, actually, and I read it in the Telegraph about how the political system had been designed, and I just loved the word designed. It hasn't been designed at all. It has come about through a series of compromises, through pressure. You know, I think, again, I don't want to go, we could go too much into a history lesson, couldn't we? But I'm thinking about the 1832 Reform Act, and I'm thinking, yeah, you know, and I contrast it with Russia. That staved off revolution because it got the middle classes involved, but that still wasn't really fully democratic enough. Then more pressure was applied. The Liberal Party played a big lead in the 19th century, and that, interestingly, was a coalition when it was put together in pushing for universal male suffrage. But then women haven't had the vote for it's less than 100 years since they got the vote. I find that amazing. So I think it is evolutionary. But that's not a conservative approach.
I'm going to just, since you are a historian, I'm just going to, the ancestor party of your party, the Liberals, the old Whigs in the 18th century, were a junta, a coalition of aristocratic landowners beating down the British citizen into an exploitative mess.
Is one interpretation.
Is that a proud history?
Yes, because also in there you've missed out the nonconformists. And what you've also missed out, and I suppose the reason perhaps why things are evolutionary, I reckon we could take things much faster, but also there is a conservative element. And so what you have to do is negotiate with that. You have to compromise with that, and that makes things evolutionary.
I think we've been having far too much fun with the history here. Okay. We have to turn to the present day a little bit. Now, present day politics, Liberal Democratic Party, why? Why do you choose them?
Oh, unfortunately, I'm going to try and avoid talking about history too much, but I see the Liberal Democrats as part of a strong English tradition of liberalism. And you look around the world, I'm looking at Russia, I'm thinking of Putin, and I'm thinking of how the absence of an evolved democracy there. Things such as freedom of speech are very important to Liberals.
But none of the other political parties standing in this British election are comparable to Putin or to
No, of course
Chavez
not. I certainly wouldn't say that at all. But I'd say there's a tradition that the of liberalism, and liberal ideas and freedom of speech that, for example, it's the Liberal Party who began the welfare state, you know, just before the First World War.
And all that.
Yes, and I would see that tradition as going on. And I would see it's the Liberal Democrats who have pushed very hard for renewables. They're the new areas that we need to push in. The Liberal Democrats are still pushing for political reform.
A lot of those achievements could also be claimed by the Tories. I mean, the Disraeli bills in the 1867
and I feel they're very good at doing that,
your coalition with the Tories, though, has been an absolute disaster for you, hasn't it?
It's not how I'd see it. If, in terms of, it's so much easier, isn't it, when you're not actually in the limelight, when you're not actually there having to make the decisions, to say what you would do and to win affection.
Well, this is politics and poetry and government in prose, isn't it?
Yeah, so therefore you get into power, you're going to be criticised. Things are not going to go as you want. You're going to have to compromise. But in terms of, I mean, I'd pick out, you know, pupil premium, and there's tons of stuff as well that I would say the Liberal Democrats have put those ideas there. And although it's nice to be liked, the important thing, you started off the interview saying about it is about change. And I think the Liberal Democrats have played a part in cutting the deficit, and they've supported that quite rightly, and the Conservatives are right about that. There's other aspects of the Conservative Party as a mass that concern me, and that's also why I'm a Liberal Democrat, and I think they would have hacked too much into the public sector. I'm not sure about their attitude towards the National Health Service, despite what they might claim. And also with education. So I think the Liberal Democrats have been a fantastically moderating voice.
Let's just talk about education. I mean, firstly, because you're a teacher, so you have a particular expertise in this. But secondly, Nick Clegg made that promise, aware, presumably, that that government is different from opposition, but he made that promise about tuition fees, and then he broke it. That's very damaging, isn't it? I mean, that's not damaging not so much as the quality of the policy, but damaging to the perception of the quality of the man.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that was unfortunate for him, and I think he got that wrong before the election. But I don't think I'm saying anything particularly profound there. And breaking promises, I can't defend breaking promises. What I can put forward as an explanation, which I would stick to, is that coalition involves compromise, and so that was the compromise that had to be made.
There's another compromise that was made between the two parties, the Tories and the Liberals, as they went into coalition, about bringing forward a referendum for proportional representation, something that the Liberals very much wanted, and the Liberals, in return for that, supporting the Boundary Commission's suggestions about boundary change, so that there's the same number of voters in each constituency, so that each MP represents the same number of people.
Yes.
Now, you got your referendum, and you lost, and yet you won't provide the support for the boundary changes.
Yeah, well, actually, to speak as an individual, that's another reason why I'm a Liberal. I find it hard, and it is concerning, because there's certain areas that currently, if you altered the boundaries, for example, if you moved Cleethorpes in a certain direction, it would become harder for a Liberal Democrat or for a Labour politician to win it. However, I would actually say, yeah, I find it hard to argue against that principle. That would be something as an individual that I would be looking to push, because just because something's inconvenient, I can't ignore it, can I?
No, well, I would. It's not for me to say. I'm humble and impartial journalist, and no more than that. But you bring it down very nicely to the local level there. I suppose where those lines are drawn will make a difference. But I don't think anybody's suggesting that the Boundary Commission's suggestions are gerrymandering in any way.
No, I'm not trying to imply that either. I suppose what I'm saying is that theoretically, it's the Liberal Democrats, you change boundaries without gerrymandering, and I'm not making that accusation. There will be winners and losers. I can't predict what that is. Part of me as a wannabe politician is immediately thinking, wow, is that going to be to the disadvantage of somebody like me? But also I'm coming back to this point of principle, that you know, if it is equal, I don't think you can argue with that really, and I want to see, I don't think our system is democratic enough. Well, and I want to see further change.
If we can accept that with a first-past-the-post system, as we have now, then it's only democratic if there are about the same number of people per MP, equal representation. If there were proportional representation, which you would like, presumably as a matter of principle rather than convenience to the Liberal Party, once it would have been a great advantage to the Libs. Now, with the much more multi-party system we have here, proportional representation would be even more disastrous for the Liberal Democrats than the first-past-the-post system.
Yeah, and just to be absolutely bold about it, if our policies aren't good enough, and if our arguments aren't good enough, and therefore we suffer as a result of a system that's fair, well, that's unfortunate. I've got the confidence that our policies will be good enough, our arguments will be good enough, and therefore we won't suffer. We've definitely suffered because We'd been out of power, I think it was for 80 years. Then you get into power. I think everybody would have anticipated a degree of falling off of support, and it's probably been more pronounced than what was expected. But Liberal Democrat Party membership is up.
It's a precipitous fall in support, isn't it? And good for the membership, but the fall in support amongst the voters is
well, we haven't had the election yet, so we'll be able to decide that afterwards.
In the elections last year, for the local elections and the European parliamentary elections, there was a cataclysmic drop, wasn't there? Forgive me, I'm almost rubbing in. I have no politics here myself.
Yeah.
I don't wish to intrude on private grief. But you don't have a Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament.
Yes.
Which is a house in which you've traditionally been well represented, and you're losing. You have fewer members than the Greens.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's an implication in your question that should the Liberal Democrat Party and should people like me therefore advocate things that would be more populist in order to get votes? Well, that's clearly not what I want to do, the way I've just set it up there. I think we've been successful in government. I'm really proud of what Liberal Democrats have done in government, really proud of the input they've had. They've been effective. We need to keep doing that. We need to get our message across.
Right, that's a very nice note on which to stop for half-time. Please join me after the break. Welcome back. My guest this week is Roy Horrobin, parliamentary candidate for Cleethorpes and Immingham for the Liberal Democrats. Roy, just before we stopped there, we were talking about the possibilities of other parties and how British politics has changed completely in the last half-decade or so. And the other parties that I'm thinking of are the UKIP, the Greens, and, paradoxically, for those of us who live on the banks of the Humber, the Scottish National Party. Now, the chances are the next government will be a coalition. It might involve the Liberal Democrats, they're not necessarily.
Absolutely.
Who would you be willing to go into partnership with?
Wow. Yeah, because one of the criticisms is that, I remember that this has been said a lot, hasn't it, about Labour didn't think about this question enough. And funnily enough, I haven't thought about that particularly, because what I'm thinking is nobody votes for a coalition.
No.
What you've got to do is set out your stall. I would be interested. I'm thinking it would be hard to work with UKIP, surely. As a pro-European myself, a Liberal Democrat, I've got to be pro-European. We've probably got fundamentally different attitudes there. But I don't know. It all depends on what... You can't anticipate the conversation beforehand, can you? We've worked with the Conservatives, so it is possible to work with the Conservatives. I certainly think it would be possible to work with Labour. I've now gone on to answer the question, haven't I, despite what I said. It would certainly be possible to work with Labour. My big concern with Labour, but I see a role for the Liberal Democrats, big concern with Labour is, and I know it sounds like such a cliche, but it seems written into the DNA of Labour that this sort of spend mentality. And you do have to borrow money. But again, all the time, you've got to be thinking carefully, what are the consequences of doing this? So the Liberal Democrats could there play a different role in terms of being sympathetic to public sector, so forth, but also we have played a significant part, Danny Alexander, in cutting the budget deficit.
Well, you mentioned the Labour Party there. I can't really perceive the difference in the Labour policy towards the deficit and the Liberal Democrat policy. Both of you want to cut the deficit, but not to cut the debt itself, whereas the Conservatives want to cut the debt itself as well. Now, that's more austere, and that's going to be harder. That's a bigger challenge. You and Labour both have the less painful policy, but perhaps less effective policy of wanting to cut any of the deficit. Where's the difference between you?
Yeah, okay, well, I think I can answer that. I don't know whether this is a rather painful or bad analogy, but it's like a credit card. Many of us have credit cards, many of us use credit cards. But using a credit card, you have to be careful, but it's not that you shouldn't have one. If you are the sort of person who thinks, oh, it's fine, I'll put it on the credit card, I'll get another credit card. And I come back to what I've said. I think there is a fundamental difference in the DNA of the Liberal Democrats and their thinking about money between the Conservatives and Labour. With Labour, I think the fundamental difference is that a Liberal Democrat's always going to be thinking, we have to balance the books, but also we have to think about people. And if you savagely hack in to services, well, actually, in the long run, that's going to be financially more expensive. So it's that it's that balancing, it's that middle ground answer of concern about debt, concern about deficit, but also concern about people. And the Conservative Party as a group, I know there's many individual Conservatives, you know, who are very concerned, but as a party, it seems to be, first of all, let's cut and to hell with the consequences to an extent. So I feel that's the difference. So although the policies sound similar, I feel that the different approaches and the mindset is quite different.
Would it be difficult? You have to be quite diplomatic, don't you? Because you're going to be, on the 8th of May, your leaders are going to be having delicate conversations. Or perhaps they won't even be invited, who knows?
Yeah.
That's another scenario I'll put to you in a moment. But don't all the parties have a sort of shared common philosophy behind them? Not as specific on the deficit, but all the parties want about 40–45% of GDP to be going through the state. That's not particularly a question of liberalism or of any other political philosophy. Yes. Have we not inherited, you being the historian, the organic system that we've inherited, not in the structures of the constitution, but in the party ideologies? We've got a sort of bland, taupe, mixed up lack of choice.
Well, I don't know. I suppose, you know, a historical analogy, Russian Revolution is very exciting, but lots of people died. So if bland is a successful country in an economy...
I like boring politics too, I feel that much safer, right? But it's that there's a lack of philosophical difference. I'm not suggesting it would be more fun if there was violence, but there's a lack of philosophical difference.
Well, I don't know whether that's true. I mean, I wonder about the Labour Party. I think it's easier for us, but I wonder about the Labour Party as in we're living in, you know, the formation of the Labour Party, early 20th century, very clear-cut National Health Service, which they built upon liberal ideas there, but launched a National Health Service. But now looking at Labour politicians, typically, they don't seem to... maybe I've just got a stereotype that's out of date, but I think there is an issue there. Conservatives, I think they've got a clear role. There's always a need, perhaps, for people who sort of think, whoa, let's steady on there. Let's not rush into things. With the Liberals, I think there is a difference. I think there's also a lot of common ground, but again, controversially, perhaps for people like Russell Brand, that's the success. We are, you know, we've got, I think it's the 6th most successful economy in the world. We are a small country. We are a peaceful nation. Things are working, and partly that's because there is a lot of consensus that allows then intelligent discussion to take place and refining of policy.
One final speculative question about who you might be involved with after the election.
Yeah.
Could you imagine going into coalition with the Scottish National Party? Could you imagine serving in a government coalition in which the Prime Minister is Alex Salmond?
I am really concerned about that. With the whole Scottish referendum thing, I was definitely on the side of England and Scotland staying together. That's how I felt. It was an emotional thing, as it was, I think, for English people and Scottish people, their feelings about that. It wasn't a hard-nosed economic one. Whereas for me, Europe is not an emotional thing, that's a hard-nosed economic thing. But I am concerned. I am concerned there's a sort of stridency, and I'm worried about, because I'm concerned particularly about the north of England, obviously, in places like Cleethorpes and Grimsby, and I feel we have been neglected. And I'm worried, though I am genuinely worried that we're going to be squeezed in the interests of the Scottish population. So and also I wouldn't particularly speak out against that, but yes, I am concerned about that, yeah.
I'm going to get a bit more local now.
Yeah.
Liberal democratic policies, how specifically would they benefit the people of Cleethorpes and Immingham?
Well, I think it's one great example that's come out in the last few weeks. £10 million has come the way of Cleethorpes, and there's going to be money spent in the area of Cleethorpes.
You're taking the credit for that for the Lib Dems rather than the Conservatives?
Yes, I am taking the credit for that, and I double-checked this because I thought, that's fantastic. So I got in contact with Vince Cable's office and said, look, I'm going to be asked about this at some point, I know. I want to check, is this Liberal Democrat? And they said, yes, please, shout away. This is 10 million Liberal Democrat money. That's why it's come.
You mentioned the European Union a minute ago. A lot of people dislike being members of the European Union. It seems that UKIP is tremendously popular, not necessarily in your constituency of Immingham and Cleethorpes, but certainly in Grimsby. It's one of the main ones. Just down the coast in Skegness, that's another main target for UKIP. The Liberal Party is absolutely certain that it wants to stay in the European Union.
Yes, I'll be emphatic about that, yes. Are you saying that therefore you're in love with the system of Brussels and how things run and you think that it's very democratic? No, I don't. But again, it's the same, I'm evolution, aren't I? So I say you stay in things. I would encourage people to vote. Why? Because that's how you chip away at changing the system. Europe, we need to change it dramatically, but not leave it.
What does Europe do for us here, specifically, in your constituency?
Yeah.
What does Europe do for us?
I would say the whole renewables thing is a byproduct of being part of Europe. And that without that linking in with Europe, being part of a bigger Europe to allow that economic trade to take place, that money to come in, I don't think it would have happened. The cooperation we've got Dong, we've got Siemens here. There's an argument that perhaps that would have taken place. I don't think so. I don't think we would have got that push.
Well, is that enough? I mean, the renewable energy energy on its own right, I mean, of course it'll inject wealth into the local economy around here. But firstly, is it worth its money? Renewable energy? Is it going to bring in more energy than it costs to actually put up and get out there? And secondly, how happy are you about relying on one industry?
Okay, if I take those questions in the wrong order, I'm sure you'll sort me out.
You're forgiven.
I'm going to reverse it. I'm not happy relying on one industry. And again, what I would argue is Liberal Democrats are the party of innovation. What would I be looking for if I was Cleethorpes MP? What's the next thing? What next things that we can get? You cannot rely on one industry. That's the massive message of the past, isn't it? Big mistake. Renewables as well, though, there's all sorts of diversification that goes on from renewables. So there's research that could be taking place here. There's also, we can't give up on tidal power. It hasn't worked yet, but we need to keep working that. We're also manufacturing. We should be doing more of the manufacturing and why not in North East Lincolnshire? So there's all sorts of opportunities. And I was only hearing again, I know over the bridge at Driftmill there's a conference today, and I was listening on the radio about how hotels, and they listed all these, and I've seen that in Cleethorpes, how it's having an impact on places like restaurants, hotels. So there's that.
I just want to ask you one more question before we finish, and this is one that I asked to your colleague Steve Besant, who was standing for the Liberal Democrats in Grimsby a few weeks ago. At your conference last year, you passed a resolution saying how much you regretted the fact that football is all about winning. This was regrettable. You're a bunch of crackpots, really, aren't you?
Okay. One of the I was reading the Telegraph, not as in Grimsby Telegraph, but I'm afraid.
Have to be very quick.
Okay,
sorry.
That's not true.
Okay. That's maybe a little quicker than I expected, but I think that's a splendid place to stop. Roy Horrobin, thank you very much for coming in today, and I hope you enjoy the election.
It's been great.
Join me next week when I'll be chatting to Dr. Vicky Dunn from the Green Party, standing in Grimsby. Please be sure to join me then. Until then, goodbye.